Welcome everyone to this sixth National Planning Improvement Environmental Impact Assessment Capacity Building Training webinar. Today we are focusing on how environmental impact assessment links with a number of different areas, some of which are within the planning consenting process in terms of section 42, some of which relate to other types of environmental assessment that occur, and some relate to how EIA links to other consent regimes, and therefore how you as a planning officer should be involved or can be involved in those processes. So welcome. I'm Josh Fothergill, as I have been in the other 4 of these webinars that I have been delivering. I'm an EIA capacity building and kind of effectiveness expert and been working in environmental impact assessment for over 25 years now. I'm a fellow of the Institute for Sustainability and Environmental Professionals, ISEP, that used to be known as IEMA, and a chartered environmentalist. And some of you may well know me from the Scotland's EIA conference. I founded that back in 2017, and we've already begun planning for the 2026 version of that event, which we hope to run in October. And many of you will be aware that there are free places for planning officers to come along to that, and certainly we once again plan to have around 20 free places offered for planning officers to come to that in October. The date hasn't quite been confirmed as yet. So in terms of what we're focusing on today, we'll go through a little bit about the National Planning Hub's EIA training program and just the housekeeping of how you guys can ask questions. Then we'll dive straight into the main event, which, as I've already introduced, jumps through section 42, other assessments, and EIA linked to other consenting regimes. And then around 11:20, 11:25, we should go to our live Q&A, but you'll have the opportunity to ask questions as we go along through the webinar today, and they'll be picked up by Olivia Neem from the National Planning Hub and asked on your behalf when we get to that point. And depending on the number of questions, we'll close anywhere between about an hour's time and an hour and a quarter from now. So just in terms of the National Planning Hub itself, it's based in and led by the Scottish Government that works in partnership with the Improvement Service, and it builds on earlier hydrogen and housing hub models, and it's been tasked with providing direct support to planning authorities to accelerate decision making and development delivery. And of course, one of those areas that planning authorities and planning officers indicated they want to have improved skills on and improved confidence, particularly in, is around environmental impact assessment and the process in relation to that. And Fothergill Training and Consulting has been commissioned by the Improvement Service to deliver that EIA capacity building training program. And I suspect many of you will have been on some of our previous webinars, so you'll be familiar with that. We also have Brody's LLP, Neil Collar, who works with us and will be in for the final webinar of the series in 2 weeks' time. So in terms of the hub itself, we have quite a lot online now. So you can see down the side here, there's the National Planning Hub, hydrogen, housing, and then there's an entire subsection around EIA, which is growing and expanding all the time. So this is just on the scoping pages. There are going to be pages, an EIA glossary, a page looking at from EIA report submission to the consent decision, which is what we covered last time. And in fact, the webinar from from 2 weeks ago on the 26th of February is available to download if you wish and watch again from the events page, which is this section down here of the National Planning Hub. So you can watch again the previous events there, as well as them being embedded in these pages, but we haven't quite got the EIA report subpage up and running yet. So a very good reason to go to planninghub.scot in future weeks and look at the EIA sections, because it is updating. One quick ask of you guys before we get started, and it is a real plea, because if you want to see more programs like this and more capacity building, not just in EIA but in other areas, then we do need to understand the impact and influence of this work. So we did a baseline survey, 190 of you fantastically got involved in that. We have sent this link out through heads of planning, and it will be being highlighted to them in another bulletin shortly, and it is out on our webinar 5 details as well. But if you do get the opportunity before next Friday, the 20th of March, to take this 5-minute survey, that would be really, really important and really, really good for getting more Planning Hub activities organised and showing their influence on practice to help the next activities that we take forward. So I believe that's been dropped into the Q&A or the chat, possibly the chat. So please have a look and copy that and take that survey. Obviously not right now, because we're just about to do the live webinar. Just in terms of some housekeeping for today, your microphone and camera are switched off for the session. You will have a recording of the session, but we'll cut the Q&A section from that recording. So feel free to ask any questions you want without worry as we go through the process. In terms of that Q&A, if you can access and use the tab that looks like this, Q&A, rather than chat for your EIA questions, that helps us. We tend to keep the chat function just for technical issues, but if your technical issue is that you can't find the Q&A button and it doesn't exist on your link, then obviously feel free to drop it in there. But ideally, please use the MS Teams Q&A function for your questions. You can drop them in as we go along, or you can save those and fill them in as we're at the live Q&A. And we'll do that after the webinar, the live delivery. So we're moving away from what we covered over the last 3 modules in the course, those focused on key planning officer procedures that needed to be undertaken, activities around screening, around scoping, and managing the application of an EIA development. So we're now moving on to how EIA links to a number of different areas. And this, the call for this really came out of our engagement with yourselves as planning officers through that baseline survey, so showing the importance of those surveys, and also through an engagement workshop we ran with a number of planning officers from I think around 8 or 9 different planning authorities back in January. So what came out of that was a desire to understand a little bit more about how EIA links with Section 42 applications, how EIA links with a number of different environmental assessments, and also the linkage between for planning officers with EIA when it's undertaken under different consenting regimes. So we're going to move through each of those as we go today. Our learning objectives are therefore, unsurprisingly, to build your core understanding and improve your confidence around how EIA relates to those Section 42 applications, focus on some common areas of confusion, and perhaps identify some areas for pragmatism. We'll then go on to look at building your understanding of links and distinctions, potential efficiencies between EIA and a number of other forms of environmental assessment or appraisal. In particular, we're going to touch on the habitat regulations, climate change under NPPF4, and the strategic environmental assessment process. Apologies that we couldn't cover more, but there's only so much we can fit into one of these sessions. And then finally, look at your core understanding and build that around the breadth of EIA roles that the EIA plays in other consenting regimes beyond the planning system, and equally how the planning authority and you as planning officers might need to get involved in those processes. So rather than being a decision maker, you may well be a consultee into those processes and how we use the EIA process then. So just a very quick refresher, environmental impact assessment, a decision support tool being applied before we're determining our planning permission for those developments likely to have significant effects on the environment. It is a legislative requirement, so we're going to have to make sure that we comply with those procedures, hence the focus on those in the previous webinars that have been in this course, and it's applied across UK development consent processes. So that includes the planning system, but as we'll see in the final section today, it also includes quite a number of other regimes. And of course, the environment is already considered within the planning system, but the EIA process applies a more rigorous approach to the form of environmental assessment undertaken and provides greater opportunities for risks related to the environment and communities to be explored in more depth. So let's move on to our first subject for today, Section 42 and EIA development. So I'm sure all of you are thoroughly familiar with what Section 42 is, but let's just have a quick refresher in relation to it. So Section 42 applies where a development with an existing consent is seeking a new consent, but with different conditions from those attached to the previous permission, and it's for the same development. So effectively what we've got is an application to vary a consent, but the result of that application is a brand new permission and therefore a brand new kind of consenting process that is being undertaken. So in relation to this, there is some guidance set out in the Scottish Government's Planning Circular 3/2022, and that is on the development management procedures. Particularly in there, we're interested in Appendix H. So the granting of this Section 42 leads to the awarding of a new consent. So we have the original planning permission is still in effect, but we have the new planning permission with whatever has been changed. Maybe a condition has been taken away, a condition has been changed from that original permission. So the development ultimately has two permissions. So the Planning Circular 2022, 3/2022, in terms of Appendix H, which is the area that focuses on Section 42, indicates unless legislation states otherwise, the statutory requirements on applications for planning permission and planning permission in principle apply to applications under Section 42 for planning permission or planning permission in principle. So that might sound obvious, but really what it's clearly stating there is the fact that what it's really stating there is the fact that this is a new consent and therefore the full legislative process for planning permission or planning permission in principle applies to a Section 42 as it would to the original application. And then going further into Appendix H and looking at additional requirement, its particular reference it makes to EIA. Requirements set out in other legislation apply as for any application for planning permission. So that includes the habitat regulation requirements, but also the provisions under the EIA regulations. So the requirements set out under the provision of the EIA regulations apply as for any application for planning permission. So if we've had an EIA on the original development, then we're going to be looking at an EIA development in relation to our Section 42 application and therefore handling it in the same way. So just a refresher on EIA, yes, it's decision support. I highlighted that in our previous refresher, but it does have some teeth, and those teeth are it has a prohibition to grant consent under the Town and Country Planning EIA Scotland regs. This prohibition to grant consent or multi-stage consent, so what we would know in planning officers as approval of matters specified in condition, we're prohibited from granting that for a development that requires EIA unless an environmental impact assessment has been carried out. So that prohibition applies just as much to a Section 42 as it would to a standard planning application, and therefore if the Section 42 development requires EIA, then we're prohibited from granting that permission unless an environmental impact assessment has been carried out. So because that's successful, the Section 42 application would lead to a new consent. The planning authority needs to deliver that regulatory definition of environmental impact assessment as part of the process, and we'll go into what that is in the coming slides. And if you want to dive deeper into that, you can go back to the first webinar or the first two webinars where we talk about those definitions. So a failure to deliver EIA's regulatory due process, the procedures that are set out in the regulations, carries risk in relation to any consent that's awarded in terms of potentially being judicially reviewed. Obviously, there are judicial reviews always, but if we fail to meet those EIA requirements, then the risk of losing that judicial review is going to be significantly greater. So we've got a Section 42. The legislation applies as if it's a standard planning application. Which aspects of EIA apply? Well, in short, all of them. The full requirements of the EIA regulations are going to apply. So this includes screening. If the Section 42 relates to a Schedule 2 development, then we need to know, is it EIA development? If it's mandatory EIA, if it's under Schedule 1, then of course it's going to be EIA development. And we'll come on a bit more to discuss the details of that screening in our next slide. Obviously, if it's an EIA development and the developer wishes to seek a scoping opinion, then they're able to come and ask for that. So despite Section 42 removing wider pre-application engagement, EIA is a separate set of regulations and its full requirements apply. So should the developer want to seek a scoping opinion, in many cases they're not going to, but should they wish to seek one, they still are allowed to do that under the process. The developer is going to be required to submit an EIA report alongside their Section 42 application if it's found to be an EIA development and therefore needing to comply with the regulations. And then, of course, you as a planning authority are going to have to lead the consultation process, the examination of the environmental information, the EIA report, the representations that come back, and if you make any supplementary information requests, then that content, and of course then integrating the recent conclusions that come out of that examination, those recent conclusions on significant effects, into the consent decision for the Section 42 process. So in terms of screening, two different ways to, two different kind of scenarios we'll look at here. If the original consent related to an EIA development, so the original permission was an EIA development, had gone through the full EIA process, then EIA screening is likely to be needed, but given that the development is unchanged, only the conditions are being altered, it's very unlikely that the Section 42 application could reasonably be found not to require EIA if the original application had been found to require EIA. It isn't the same, though, as a multi-stage screening process in terms of how you would apply screening to the approval of matters specified in condition. So we cannot simply look at the previous EIA report and consider whether sufficient information is there or whether we need to request supplementary information. Because we are producing a new consent, we do have to screen it in the way as if it's a unique development. Of course, that doesn't mean we can't use the previous screening findings in order to justify that finding and make a lot of efficiencies, but it does need to be screened. It may well equally be that the Section 42 application comes in with an EIA report submitted alongside it, which then, of course, would remove the need for screening because the developer has kind of self-screened into the process. The other scenario we're going to look at is if the planning authority screened the original consent and found it didn't require EIA, but it is still a Schedule 2 development, then you are still going to need to produce a new screening opinion specific to that Section 42 application. Obviously, this is part of that requirement to verify, is this an EIA development or not? So even though the original, we identified that it wasn't, because we're getting a new consent, we have to go through that process again. So we can make use of that previous screening, but we need to consider whether that changed condition or conditions that are being requested would have significant environmental implications, and also whether the wider context has materially changed that would affect our original screening document. So we can't simply pick up the previous one and just rubber stamp it, copy it across and move it on. We do need to apply some thought to say, well, what are the conditions being changed? Might that have any environmental implications? And equally, if some time has passed, considerable time has passed, has anything materially changed that we need to take into account as well in relation to that process? So we need to be screening these, but we can utilize the previous findings, and they are likely to be similar findings. In terms of moving on then to the actual submission, so from submission of the Section 42 to the consent, and in this case we're assuming that Section 42 is an EIA development, so it therefore needs to meet those requirements. So as set out in that earlier quote, requirements set in other legislation apply as for any application for planning permission, including the provisions of the EIA regulations. So as a consequence, you as the planning authority are going to need to deliver all of Regulation 4's definition of EIA. So that includes the developer preparing an EIA report, that includes the carrying out of consultation, publication and notification around that EIA report, the examination of the information that comes back, so the EIA report and any representations, making your recent conclusions to feed into the decision-making process, and then making sure that the decision notice identifies and describes the environmental information that's required. And of course, The detail around this slide and all of how to do that is what we covered in the previous module of the course. So you can go back and look at webinar 5 if you want to know any more detail about that. We're of course going to look into a little bit more of this in terms of the specifics of what do we mean by an acceptable EIA report in relation to a Section 42 application. So what should be our expectations as planning officers for a Section 42 EIA report? So Section 42 EIA report needs to meet itself needs to meet the requirements of the EIA regulations. As with any other application for planning permission, it needs to comply with those requirements. So it needs to meet the requirements of EIA Regulation 5 and the relevant aspects of Schedule 4. So that's describing the development, identifying likely significant effects, looking at design and mitigation measures that relate to significant adverse effects, looking at any reasonable alternatives that the developer has considered, producing a non-technical summary, that's the Regulation 5 requirements, and then the relevant aspects of Schedule 4, which go into additional detail in relation to baseline, the mitigation, the development, etc. So we need to make sure that the actual EIA report that comes in for the Section 42 is meeting those requirements. It may well be that the applicant can simply resubmit the same EIA report as the original consent. However, that's something that you guys as the planning authority need to think about and consider. Has the proposed Section 42 changed to conditions? Do they relate to the environment? Could they have implications for the environment as a consequence? Do they potentially change the findings that were previously set out in the original permissions EIA report? And then I guess another key thing to consider is how much time has passed. Might you require certain updates, an EIA report, the original EIA report plus addendums in relation to maybe the baseline, in relation to other projects that have now been consented and need to be considered cumulatively with this Section 42? Remember, a key thing in the regulations is that your significance conclusions need to be up to date at the point of consent. And if you're simply getting an EIA report that was perhaps produced 4 or 5 years ago, or was originally some of the data in it was 4 or 5 years old, you guys need to decide and make some consideration as to whether you consider that to be accurate and appropriate and up to date. I just wanted to give a word on comparative EIA reports because we've had a few questions and there was some discussion at our January workshop with planning officers around this. So this is where a developer seeks to submit a kind of comparative or far more abridged EIA report. So they might say, well, oh, the other report covered everything that you really need, so this is just the changes and we'll do something much shorter. So it might not include any baseline, because it seeks to just simply cross-reference to the original EIA report's content. Now, the difficulty here is that might well put you guys at risk as a planning authority, because it might put you in a place where the EIA report that is submitted simply for the Section 42 doesn't meet that definition of what an EIA report is, and that could bring opportunities for challenge and judicial review. So there have been certainly activities where comparative EIA reports are produced in other areas. The Electricity Works Act under Section 36 and the Energy Consents Unit, I think, are able to accept that type of activity, but that's an entirely different piece of legislation, and varying things in relation to that have different implications for that very different different consent through that different legislation. So for us in the planning system, our Section 42 is leading to a new consent. It therefore needs to itself fully comply with the EIA regulations, and therefore it needs an EIA report that in its documentation meets the requirements of what an EIA report is. As I say, that might be able to reuse the vast majority, if not all, of what was previously there. It might be that plus an addendum, but simply trying to cut down that information can bring in some potential risks for planning authorities, so it's worth being aware of that. Sources of advice before we move on to our next section. Key sources of advice, Planning Circular 3/2022, Development Management Procedures. It doesn't say an awful lot on EIA, but it does have those key references in that we need to fully comply with the requirements. There are some wider UK references that do touch on EIA for this, contextual references only. So obviously they aren't Scottish documents, so you might read them for interest, but you can't necessarily directly apply them. So in Northern Ireland, under Development Management Practice Note 9B, EIA screening, there is a section about EIA and Section 54 applications for screening of those. That's the equivalent of a Section 42 in Scotland. And then in England's guidance in relation to Section 73 applications, again, the English equivalent of a Section 42, then there is a little bit of additional guidance there under the heading of do the EIA regulations apply? And unsurprisingly, the answer is yes, but they do provide a little bit more contextual information that you might want to read just to get some wider context. Okay, we're going to move on now to how EIA sometimes links or overlaps with other assessments. So one of the reasons EIA is going to bump into other assessments on a fairly regular basis is that where EIA is triggered, the environmental aspects of it, the factors within it are very, very broad. Now, we're only particularly interested in the significant effects on those factors, but in order to get to those significant effects, we need to, of course, look at each of these different areas. So a very wide range of different areas: population, human health, through biodiversity and ecology sides of things, then more, I suppose, the base ecosystem and habitats of land, soil, water and air, but then things like climate impacts, material assets such as waste and energy usage, cultural heritage, landscape, visual effects, etc. So there's a broad reach of different areas. So inevitably, there are going to be policy requirements, there are going to be other legislative requirements that sit out there and lead to some overlap for certain planning applications. So multiple sources, as I briefly mentioned on that previous slide, of other forms of environmental assessment. So these can be required through legislation, things like the habitat regulation assessment that comes forward, water framework regulation requirements, assessments in relation to condition assessment for designated sites, or from those particular designations. And that could be Scottish legislation. It could even go up to international legislation when we're looking at things like World Heritage sites, for example, and the need to have compliance. So there can be a need for assessment that comes out of other legislation than the EIA requirements, and both of those pieces of legislation can apply to a planning application. But then additionally, of course, there can be policy requirements. So within NPF4 and equally within your planning authority's own policies within its plan and other documents, there can be policies that set out an expectation for environmental assessment or some form of environmental assessment, a heritage assessment, a conservation assessment, etc. So in many cases, these things can nicely be layered, and the EIA can kind of adopt and bring in this type of assessment within itself. So where EIA is required, many of these other assessments can be brought into the process, and that can drive efficiency, and effectively the EIA will become the reporting body for that, or major reporting document for that. There might be a separate appendix that provides a little bit of specific information, but the EIA becomes the main housing. There are on occasions, particularly with the habitat regulation, where an appropriate assessment or a shadow appropriate assessment because of course ultimately you guys technically undertake the appropriate assessment in HRA, then there can be particular requirements that require separate reporting, and the HABS regs is one of those. So we're now going to jump in and just look at three different areas: the HABS regs, NPF4's climate policy and strategic environmental assessment, and look at some of the similarities and differences in relation to these. So first we'll start with EIA and HABS regs assessment, or more generally, it's going to be the appropriate assessment component of that process. Of course, under HRA, there's 4 stages. We get the screening stage. Do we need to look at things? And then the appropriate assessment itself. If we find through appropriate assessment there's risks to the conservation objectives, then we might need to go on to looking at alternative options and whether there are any for the project. And ultimately, if we're still finding adverse effects on integrity of those sites, we're going to be into imperative reasons of overriding public interest, so a much stronger piece of legislation. There are links. There is an expectation in the EIA regulations that you as the planning authority are going to coordinate these two assessments. This was something added in 2017. To be perfectly honest, there's not a lot of detail about what do we mean by coordination between these assessments. I think in reality, what we're talking about is when you guys are coming to your reasoned conclusions on significance for EIA, and you're going through the appropriate assessment process to understand adverse effects on integrity, we want to see a consistency in relation to those findings. So we're not saying, well, it's terribly bad under the HABS regs, but under EIA, there's no problem. We need to see consistency there. And therefore, of course, what we'd like to see under the developer's EIA report is that, it's hopefully avoiding a lot of duplication. It's saying the HABS regs are covering this, 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 and this, but it is highlighting, here are the key results, here are the key findings, and translating those into EIA terminology in terms of significant effects, as opposed to HRA terminology, which is going to be adverse effects on the integrity of a site in relation to its conservation objectives. So as a minimum, what we're going to be expecting to see and what we'll be looking at and what you should be hoping for in the developers' documents that come in is consistency between those findings that relate to the site's special areas, conservation, special protection areas, etc., that are protected under the HABS regs. In terms of some similarities, and then we'll go on some differences between these tools. So in terms of similarities, their scope is pretty similar. They're applying to projects in a very similar manner. Both are forms of impact assessment, both forms of environmental assessment, in fact. And of course, they have some overlapping terminology. In their legislation, there is that. So HABS regs does have a screening stage, and of course, EIA has its screening stage. But they have different rules in relation to those processes. And unfortunately, in practice, a lot more terminology tends to get carried across between the two, when in reality, we really should be a bit more careful and distinct between the terminology that we're using in relation to those. So when we're looking at distinct differences between what EIA expects and the HABS regs, habitat regulation assessment, much more specific to particular species or habitats, so special protection areas, special areas of conservation, Ramsar sites, as opposed to EIA's broader definition of the environment. HABS regs has a 4-stage process. Most of the time, we're going to go through the screening process because we can't really take mitigation into account, even the avoid or prevent. So there's a difference with EIA, where we can take avoid or prevent mitigation into account. The appropriate assessment stage, there's a greater expectation of the precautionary principle in that process and in terms of scientific certainty of the findings. And then if we're still finding adverse effects on integrity of the conservation objectives for our protected site, then the HABS regs moves on to increasingly more challenging stages for the developer. Are there alternative options that would achieve what we're trying to achieve? If there are, we need to take them. If they won't have impacts on a HABS reg site, if we conclude there are no alternative options, then if there's still significant, if there are still adverse effects on integrity, I nearly fell into the trap myself there, then we need to go through imperative reasons of overriding public interest in order to be able to consent that. And that's a very, very high bar that is set by the HABS regs there. So it's much more of an absolute test is the process that the HABS reg sets out, whereas EIA is very much, decision support. It is providing those significance findings in relation to the environment is EIA, and then saying take this into account as part of the other material issues that you are going to consider in determining the consent, whereas HRA effectively draws a line and says if there are adverse effects on integrity, then it's going to be very challenging to consent this project, and you've got to go through those later stages. And as I mentioned, generally a much greater expectation of kind of scientific evidence in relation to that link between and demonstrating that link in terms of the effect on the conservation objectives and the environment and the adverse effect to its kind of future integrity of that site. HRA finally has its own terminology as well. So I've been using a lot of that. I did slip up just the once, but yes, adverse effects on the integrity, undermining the conservation objectives is really what we're looking for there in terms of terminology rather than significance, although there is unfortunately in practice quite a lot of overlap between those two. And just another area is HRA talks about in combination effects between the project that you're looking at for consenting and other projects. EIA talks about the same thing, but its terminology is cumulative effects. So we need to be aware of those differences as well, and ideally try not to mix them up. Otherwise, we can drive some confusion. If we start talking about in combination effects within EIA, that's not something that's actually set out in the legislation. So we really need to try and keep that focused on cumulative effects. Although, of course, we'd want consistency, ideally, between the other projects that have been chosen to be included in the assessments. So we're going to move on from EIA and HRA now to think about EIA and climate policy, and particularly the policy in MPF4, which has obviously been around for a little bit of time. So we're thinking about policy 2. Proposals will be cited and designed to minimise life cycle greenhouse gas emissions as far as possible and to adapt to current and future risks from climate change. So this was a substantial new policy when MPF4 was launched. Obviously now we're going to be fairly familiar with it as planning officers because it's been in place for quite a number of years now. But in order for us to consider that, in relation to planning applications, we might well need certain assessments, certain considerations undertaken that are driven by that policy. The EIA, if a project requires an EIA, also has a driver to consider the same things or similar things. So paragraph 5 of Schedule 4, so these are the if relevant sections of a developer's EIA report, requires the impact of the project on climate, for example, the nature and magnitude of greenhouse gas emissions, and the vulnerability of the project to climate change to be considered as part of the assessment and obviously reported upon if there are significant effects on either of those aspects. So we have two different drivers that are looking at very similar, if not the same things. The MPF4 approach has been set out and has been available now for a little bit of time in relation to the planning guidance on climate change mitigation and adaptation. And this was something that was requested from planning authorities and, of course, a number of wider bodies as well, in terms of seeking some guidance on the implementation of Policy 2. And it's something that was developed by the Scottish Government, but had expert working groups, including the heads of planning, who were involved in its development and its production. So we have guidance and approach in relation to that. In terms of the EIA approach, there has been IEMA guidance, which of course now is ICEP, that has been around for well over 10 years now in relation to two different guides on EIA and the different aspects of climate change. Significance remains core when we're thinking about EIA, but we need to think about what significance might mean in terms of greenhouse gas emissions and increases or changes in those, and what significance means in relation to the resilience and adaptation of the environment and how it might be impacted by climate change and the project. And that guidance in relation to climate change resilience and adaptation is being looked at the moment because it was written originally 10 years ago. It has been kind of revised a little bit since then, but 10 years ago the conversation was climate change is coming and we're going to need to start thinking about it. Now we're beginning to see the impacts of climate change in the real worlds that we're actually undertaking, so therefore how we think about that and integrate that with our project impacts may need to change. So we've got these two different guides. We need to make sure that where a project is coming forward and needs to comply with both the policy and undertake an EIA, then they need to be making sure that they're hitting both of those marks. So the resources in relation to that, last year in June, the guidance became available, and back on the 3rd of September last year, there was a planning skills webinar in relation to this guidance that you can access there. And of course, these slides, the recording will be available afterwards if you want to go in and dive in to get these links. But yes, that was a improvement service webinar with the Scottish Government in relation to the planning skills. And one of the speakers in that webinar was one of the co-authors of the ICEP guidance or guidance documents around climate change. So we have a 2020 EIA guidance on climate change resilience and adaptation. We're expecting some kind of supplementary update to that in the second half of this year. And then we have assessing greenhouse gas and evaluating significance. That had a version 2 come out in 2022, and either at the back end of this month or early next month, so either March 2026 or April 2026, we will see a substantial supplement to that come out to try and ensure that practice is using that guidance in the intended way rather than perhaps how some projects are seeking to apply it at the moment. So be aware that guidance is evolving. And of course, if we've got an application that needs to meet both of these, then we need to be aware of those expectations. But in many cases, the EIA is going to be able to meet NPF4's planning guidance and apply the expectations of EIA and therefore deliver those in an effective kind of efficient document. The final thing we're going to look at is strategic environmental assessment and how it links with EIA. So just to remind you, strategic environmental assessment is like a sibling to EIA. They're both legislative tools that seek to apply impact assessment, environmental assessments, but at different points in the planning process. So the SEA regulations are very much about influencing the plans, the strategies, the programs of activities that might come down from the strategic level. Once government has set policy, then going through the strategic environmental assessment and looking at environmental risks, trying to avoid and reduce them where possible, and then EIA comes in at the project level. So siblings in terms of legislation, but doing a somewhat different job. But hopefully, if we have had strategic environmental assessment of documents, plans and programs that relate to the project that is coming forward for consent, then there may well be opportunities for efficiency. So the purpose and basis of SEA is an assessment of certain plans and programs that pose a risk to the environment. In terms of its legislative basis for strategic environmental assessment, if that plan or program is wholly within Scotland, then there is a Scottish Act, and the Environmental Assessment Scotland Act 2005 that applies, and that is primary Scottish legislation. However, if any part of that plan or programme is in England or out in UK waters, then England's strategic environmental assessment regulations apply instead. So two different pieces of legislation that could be driving the need for SEA that then could link to a project that you guys are seeing in your authority. In most cases, however, of course, it's going to be the Scottish Act. So how can SEA link or prove helpful to the EIA process? Well, if we've had a relevant plan or programme that sits in that strategic chain above the projects that has now come in for consent, then there could well be opportunities for a degree of efficiency from this process. The first at the screening stage, a local development plan might have looked at some of the allocated, will have looked at some of the allocated sites its SEA will have done, and it may have produced an indicative screening finding for EIA. Or even if it hasn't gone that far, it may well have identified some of the key environmental risks and opportunities in relation to each of these allocated sites that then can be used as a resource, a piece of evidence for your planning officer screening decision for a Schedule 2 development. If we're getting to the scoping stage, we've identified that an EIA is required for our application, then again, the SEA of your local development plan or various other plans that might exist in your local authority that have been through SEA may well have defined key environmental issues for the area, might have been identified key environmental risks and opportunities for allocated sites. And again, this could be useful evidence for you to kind of focus on in relation to, what are going to be the key issues, what are the significant effects on that site, and give you some efficiency in relation to that. There's also the possibility, and we're seeing an increasing contribution of this, of strategic mitigation, so helping to define and set out the environmental mitigation at scale that is needed to help restore the environment, or that is needed to help large-scale kind of species and different designated sites under the habitats regulations, for example, to be protected. And that type of mitigation is sometimes identified in plans. The SEA process will contribute to that. And then where your projects come forward, it might be that some of their mitigation or some of their measures to mitigate end up at the bottom of the hierarchy, need to do some degree of compensation, and therefore they might be contributing to this. And of course, linking in terms of expectations of net gain for biodiversity as well. So that's all we're going to touch on in terms of the links with other environmental assessments. What we, of course, now need to do is just briefly go through in around the final 10 minutes or so how EIA relates to other consenting regimes outside of the planning system, and then your role as a planning officer, how you might end up interacting with those regimes. And of course, that role, if it's getting consented by someone else, your role is going to be quite different to how we've described it so far. So thus far, we've looked at yourselves as a consenting authority who are having to take a lot of the significant responsibilities of the EIA procedure. In a number of these other regimes, you are a consultee, and therefore you have different duties. So we'll talk about and touch on that over the next 10 minutes. So, does EIA apply to other forms of consent? Well, in short, yes, absolutely it does. In some European member states, back in the day when we were part of Europe, when EIA first came about, 1985, and then changed significantly in kind of 1997 into 1999, then some states went to a single consenting process, and therefore they just have one consent, and EIA applies to that. Across the UK, we chose to stick with a number of existing consents that we already had, but as a consequence of that, we had to apply EIA and bolt it on effectively to each of those different systems. The most common one by far is certainly the planning system, but there are lots of other regimes and other requirements, other consenting requirements that also apply EIA. So where we've got other consenting regimes in Scotland, EIA will have a process alongside those. Where we have activity going on in UK waters or in another UK nation, and that needs consenting, then there'll be EIA regulations applying there. And those can still have implications for Scottish planning authorities. So you'll remember, well, as the example gives here, the Scottish planning authority might be required to be consulted by the EIA process being undertaken by planning officers in an English council, because you guys are the adjacent council or one of the adjacent councils to that English planning authority. So it isn't just the Scottish regs we need to be aware of, it can be other regimes as well. And of course, the nationally significant infrastructure projects may well obviously trigger the need to have consultation with yourselves as well. So let's just look at some of the examples of the other EIA regimes, and we're just looking at some of those that are within Scotland rather than those that cover England, Wales or Northern Ireland, but there are comparable sets of EIA regulations for those as well. So we've already mentioned one of these, the first, the Electricity Works EIA Scotland regulations. So that's what's being applied by the Energy Consents Unit in relation to Section 36 and Section 37 kind of applications to them. We've got Marine Works EIA, where, if we've got an offshore wind project that's a Section 36, that's going to be going through that process. We've got roads, transport and works, agriculture, land and irrigation projects, forestry, flood risk management, offshore petroleum production and pipelines, and of course, most recently, and potentially or certainly relevant to a number of you as planning authorities, the Master Plan Consent Area Scheme EIA regulations. So where you look to use the Master Plan Consent Area, that new approach within the wider kind of planning system to give consent over a larger area for perhaps a large-scale redevelopment of urban area, or I know some authorities are looking at it for renewable energy zones, then again, EIA applies to that consent because it is giving development consent. And of course, they go through a similar process. They have screening to identify which projects require, or which of the things that are going to be consented require EIA. And then if it's identified, they go through scoping and very much the same process as yourselves. However, in the majority of those cases, you aren't going to be the planning authority. Obviously, for the master plan consent areas, you will be the authority, but for the majority of those cases, electricity works, marine works, roads, etc., you are going to play a different role in that EIA regime. So you're going to be a statutory consultee. You can also, of course, be a statutory consultee under the planning system. So your adjacent planning authority gets or has an EIA application come in, you become one of the statutory consultees as set out under the 2017 regs that we've discussed throughout this module. So where as a planning authority you're acting as a statutory consultee, then could that occur at screening? Well, not under the planning system, but yes, under some of the other regimes. So for as an example, the Electricity Works EIA regs, say the Energy Consent Unit, or technically the Scottish Ministers, but effectively it's operated through those, they must consult a planning authority who is required, and then you're required to give your views in 3 weeks, or there can be a longer period if agreed. So your role there is to provide the planning authority's views on whether the proposed development is likely to have significant effects or not. Effectively, I think the legislation of the Electricity Works indicates you should give an indication as to whether you feel it's EIA development or not. So because that is the Scottish Government who is consenting something that ultimately will be in your patch, in your local authority area, you are brought into that process. The Marine Works has a similar process, but rather than saying must, it says that the Scottish Ministers may consult the planning authority as part of the screening process. So you can see consultation in screening, not something that occurs or not formally required as part of the EIA process under town and country planning. You as a planning authority are expected to just get on with it. But in some of the other regimes, then there is this screening consultation expectation at screening that does tie yourselves into that process. In terms of scoping, of course, if the project that's being consented by another regime, another development consent process is required for EIA, then the developer has that opportunity to seek a scoping opinion, just like they would under the planning system. But in this case, you aren't the consenting authority. You're going to get written to by the Energy Consents Unit, by your adjacent planning authority, by whoever is the competent authority to ask, what are your views in relation to the scope and level of detail that the developer should put into their EIA report? So your role here isn't to produce the scoping opinion. Your role here is to give views in terms of the environmental issues that you feel are relevant to the development, any particular concerns or opportunities you feel might exist in relation to the environment and that project. And of course, there's an opportunity to indicate if you've got relevant environmental data that might be of relevance and assist that process. And then finally, in relation to the EIA report, you aren't the ones examining it, you aren't the ones who are going to have to manage all the consultation under these other regimes, but you are the statutory consultee. So you are going to receive a copy of the EIA report and the application, and you're going to have a set period to respond in. Now, the amount of time varies between the different sets of EIA regulations, and then, of course, within each of those different consent regimes, planning authorities have sometimes very specific roles and a set period that they can respond in that may well be longer than a number of the other parties. And your role here, as you're acting as a statutory consultee, is to give views on the significant effects and whether the proposed mitigation that is being put forward in relation to adverse effects, and particularly significant adverse effects, is suitable, or in some cases you might feel it's not suitable, and it might be that you want to highlight alternatives and other approaches that you would want to be seen taken forward, and potentially highlight conditions that you would hope to see put upon the consent if it's given. Of course, and there was a question last time about does the ECU in giving a Section 36 consent have to apply conditions that have been proposed by a planning authority? I had a chat to Neil Collar about this, and unfortunately no. Effectively the consenting authority, the competent authority, has to have that freedom, so they don't have to adopt what you guys put forward. But of course, this is your opportunity, if you're a statutory consultee, to highlight what you would like to see as conditions or mitigation, and to explain why, and to seek to justify that. And then, of course, there's opportunities to highlight your views in terms of confidence on the environmental evidence that's been put forward by the developer. So if you think it's particularly thin, particularly weak, maybe you feel the data that they have gathered isn't the most suitable data. And of course, you'll be engaging with, if you've got them, internal ecology, internal heritage experts, etc., then you can feed that into the process. Couple of other areas to be aware of just before we move into the Q&A. You can find yourself as being sat alongside a number of other consenting regimes. So you can be a planning authority that needs to give planning permission to part of a project under the town and country planning, but there could be a number of other consenting authorities involved. So this could be a long linear project that needs a number of different planning permissions through each of the authorities it goes through, or it could be a project that perhaps goes offshore or has elements that need to be approved as part of a different consenting process. So proposed developments are obviously not always going to nicely fit within a single planning authority boundary or just sit into a single consenting regime. So we've talked about those, the long linear developments like pipelines, offshore winds and their onshore infrastructure and those kind of issues. So even though there can be different EIA regimes, where EIA does apply, it applies to the whole development. So despite the fact that multiple sets of EIA regs apply, we don't then cut it down to just those bits. We still look at the environmental implications of the whole development. Of course, as the planning authority where you are making your decision on the planning application that's come to you, that's what you need to focus in on. But the EIA is going to need to be aware of and take account and present the significant effects of the whole development. And that often is going to mean that the scoping process and the EIA report includes multiple issues that might be beyond your planning authority boundaries or even well beyond your planning authority boundaries for a large scale pipeline or road or that type of thing. So worth being aware of. And then just the final one I did want to flag to you, and this was something that in discussions with the Scottish Government they wanted to flag, is there is a risk that some of these other regimes get stepped down where the planning system is in place. So we've the first area is EIA and permit development rights. Neil talked about this in the second module of the course. PDR are not only about small scale developments, they can be about somewhat bigger developments, and they can ultimately link to projects that require EIA. And if a project does require EIA, then it's excluded from the permit development right process. So if we have a planned permit development right or a developer comes in, they think they've got permit development rights, they're seeking to confirm that. If it's a Schedule 2 development, you guys need to screen that and confirm that EIA doesn't apply before saying, yes, you can move ahead with your PDR. If EIA does apply, then their PDR is no longer available as a right. They've got to make it an application and move it forward. The area where we get some challenge is around certain agricultural activities. So there are certain agricultural activities that kind of might sit, or aspects of them might sit into the planning system, possibly through permit development rights. But if they don't, they might trigger EIA through other particular aspects, and it's this agriculture, land drainage and irrigation regs that we're particularly interested in. So this was brought in because there was a gap in the EIA system around agricultural intensification of uncultivated lands, the moving of semi-natural areas into developments, new irrigation schemes, new drainage and restructuring of rural land holdings that weren't necessarily picked up under the planning requirements or permit development right process. So it's delivered by the Rural Payments and Inspections Division of the Scottish Government, but planning authorities need to be aware that even though there are these other EIA regulations, if PDR rights apply, then those agricultural land drainage and irrigation project regs kind of step down. They are subsumed by the EIA regs. So when you're looking at an agricultural project that's coming in, either within the planning system as an application, or if it's coming in to confirm its PDR, then you need to be appreciating, I guess, the whole projects, looking at the environmental risks in relation to those projects in their entirety, and not, just kind of simply thinking, oh, that's just a bit of, kind of land clearance or that type of thing. It could be posing significant environmental risk, and the other regs that might pick it up otherwise have to step down if PDR is given or if it goes through the planning system. So just be aware that when you're looking at some of those notification to the PA in relation to agricultural PDR, think first, is it Schedule 2? Do I need to screen it to confirm those requirements? And then if you're going through that screening process, understand what that whole project actually looks like so that you can kind of make an accurate decision in relation to that. And just to highlight, the Scottish Government has seen an increasing interest from NGOs and the public in relation to this area. So it is something that is increasingly kind of being noticed by the public and NGOs and being brought up. So it's an area to keep track on in terms of our screening. So that is us for today. We're going to move on to the Q&A. I've talked for quite a while, so apologies, probably 5 minutes longer than I planned. Hopefully you feel you've got more of a core understanding of how EIA applies in relation to those Section 42 applications that we covered right at the start of the session. Through the middle of the session, we talked about how EIA is linking to other environmental assessments and how there might be particular distinctions, but also potential efficiencies between EIA and the HABS regs assessment, NPF4's climate policy and strategic environmental assessment. And then finally, we've talked about your role as a planning officer, as a statutory consultee, but then also how you might fit in where there's multiple consents, and just finally that conversation around kind of PDR and particularly agricultural PDR and remembering the screening process and thinking about that.